Chapter 16 of Building a Railroad by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, Conclusion. Every second the speed of the handcar with its load of dynamite, enough to shatter the tunnel from foundation to roof, and its one living passenger bound to the side of the platform, increased as it dashed down the grade. Halfway down the wheels revolved so fast that the hum of the revolution struck on Don's ears with rising distinctness. It was the requiem of death. Apparently nothing could save him now. Like a flitting shadow it passed the startled gaze of a dozen men headed by Gil, who had just arrived on the scene. "What's that?" exclaimed Gil to Mike Doyle, the night watchman at the cut, whom he had fetched along. "Sure, it's a handcar running wild, sir. A handcar." A crash and a tremendous explosion cut the words out of his mouth. The face of the cliff was lit up for a moment by the glare, and then darkness, more intense than ever, settled about the scene. "Great heavens!" exclaimed Gil. "We're too late. They've dynamited the tunnel." The crowd of Italians, preceded by the boy and the watchman, made a rush for the mouth of the tunnel. Within 20 feet of it, Doyle tripped upon a yielding obstruction in his path and went floundering on his hands and knees. "What the dickens?" he began as he recovered himself and felt the object. "Why, it's a man, as I am a Christian." "Is that you, Doyle?" said a strange voice, and the figure seemed struggling to get up. "By all the blessed saints, it's never you, Mr. Winthrop, is it, sir?" "It isn't anybody else, Mike," replied the recumbent object. "Cut me loose if you've a knife handy." "Gee whiz, what's the matter with you?" "My hands are bound behind my back." "Faith, that's rough. And how did you come this way?" asked Doyle as he knelt beside his boss and fished in his pocket for the jackknife he always carried. "It's the work of Jim Kelso and his pals," answered Don, who had escaped from the handcar and certain destruction in the most remarkable manner. "I'm pretty badly shaken up. You'll hardly believe me when I say I was bound to a handcar loaded with dynamite and sent down the grade to what was apparently my death. Thank heavens I've escaped. But I'm afraid the scoundrel may have succeeded in destroying our work in the tunnel." "Sent down the grade on a car of dynamite, did you say, sir?" "Sure, we heard the explosion a minute ago, and your brother, myself, and the laborers were running down to see what damage had been done when I tripped over you. How did you happen to leave the car before she struck? Did you roll off?" "They didn't mean that I should, for they tied me on," said the boy, getting on his feet and shaking himself, as it were. "I guess I'm all right in spite of the fling I had. It all happened in a twinkling, Mike. I had just given up hope of ever seeing daylight again, but just as I made out the dark shadow of the cliff looming up before me, with the expectation of death in a couple seconds more, I felt a sudden jolt, and the rope which held me to the car parted with a snap. It must have been half rotten. I was flung off like a stone from a catapult. As I struck the ground and rolled over half stunned, a roar sounded in my ears. I did not realize another thing until I heard your voice, which I instantly recognized. It seemed the sweetest sound at the moment I had ever heard, though I could not tell how badly hurt I was. Glory, you've had a wonderful escape, Mr. Winthrop, and it's glad I'm to be able to congratulate you on the strength of it." "Amen to that, Mike," said Don, grasping the watchman's hand and giving it a hearty shake. In another moment they were at the mouth of the tunnel, where several lanterns were now twinkling and flitting about. More lanterns were to be seen around the corner of the cliff, and most of the men seemed to be gathered. "Why, how's this?" exclaimed Don in the utmost amazement. "The tunnel seems to be all right." "Sure it is," echoed the voice of Mike Doyle. "Bet your life," said an under foreman named Zottarelli, coming up with his lantern. "Everything all right, boss. No a blowing up here. Look a down, you. Take it a face off of the cliff. Great a big smash." "Come on," cried Don excitedly. "The car must have jumped the track at the last moment and hit the cliff 100 feet away. Great Scott, what a fortunate escape for us." "That you, Don?" asked Gil as his brother appeared hurriedly on the scene of the explosion. "I've been looking for you. Those scoundrels just missed doing us up all right by the looks of things. Look at the effects of the dynamite here. Why, the whole corner of the cliff is blown to fragments. That's the end of as pretty a bit of natural decoration as we have about here. Too bad, isn't it? Much better the loss of the scenic effect than the tunnel, and my life along with it," said Don solemnly. "Your life?" exclaimed Gil in a startled voice. "Why, what do you mean?" "I'll tell you all about it later," replied the brother, looking up at the ruins. A drizzling rain set in about this time, which, with the intense darkness of the night, put a stop to any further investigation of the damage done to the cliff. The two watchmen were discovered bound and gagged halfway up the hillside when a section of the party, headed by Don, started toward the hut. They did not have any expectation of seeing any trace of Jim Kelso and his crowd, however. Those scoundrels had fled immediately after the explosion of the dynamite. They had discovered the proximity of Gil Winthrop and his party of Italians, and fully believing their dastardly work had been successfully accomplished, they deemed it a prudent move to make themselves scarce. They did not go far away, as Jim Kelso was not yet prepared to shake the dust of the neighborhood from his feet. He and his son, for very cogent reasons, intended to visit the cottage before morning. After some hours, when quiet had settled down once more around the cliff, they started to make the contemplated move. Much to his rage and disappointment, Kelso found that half a dozen Italian laborers were encamped across the only road by which they could reach the top of the cliff. As many more were guarding the tunnel, though he made no attempt to go in that direction. Soon after daybreak on the following morning, Don and Gil were on the ground where the explosion had occurred, making an examination of the huge break in the cliff. "There seems to be a hole up there of some kind," remarked Don. "I'm going up to see what it is." The young engineer mounted the jagged fissure with proper caution. The opening in question appeared to be the beginning of a subterranean passage leading into the heart of the cliff. Curiosity compelled Don to enter it and to follow its course, to see where it would wind up. Whether it was the work of nature or man, the boy did not stop to consider. He penetrated the passage for a distance he thought to be about 100 yards, when he unexpectedly emerged into a cavern-like room. A lighted lantern hung from a hook stuck into the wall. By the dim light thus afforded, Don saw that there was a table, 2 stools, and a cot in the place. Upon the cot, attired as Don had last seen her, lay Nellie, the blind girl, asleep. The boy had advanced well into the underground retreat before he recognized the identity of the sleeper. "Great Scott!" he exclaimed, thoroughly astonished by his discovery. "Nellie? In this underground hole? What can it mean?" He accidentally jarred the table, and a spoon slipped from a plate of untasted food and rattled on the stone floor. The noise awoke the blind girl, and she started up in an attitude of attention. "Nellie," said Don softly, advancing to the cot. She gave a little scream of startled surprise. "Donald Winthrop, you're here." "Yes, Nellie." She sprang to her feet and extended both her hands to him. "Surely something must have happened, else you could not have gained access to this place, which is directly under the cottage." "Yes, little girl, something has happened. Kelso tried to destroy our tunnel with dynamite last night, but his plan miscarried, and instead the end of the cliff is badly shattered. Surely you must have felt the shock of the explosion." "I did. It awakened me from my sleep, but I could not understand what it meant." "The falling away of the rock disclosed an opening which I discovered this morning. I found it led into a kind of passage, and, curious to see where it went, I followed its course until I reached this cavern-like room and found you asleep on that cot. There, that's the whole story." "Then you can save my father!" she exclaimed in a fever of sudden excitement, seizing the young engineer by the arm. "You will save him, will you not, for my sake?" "Your father? What do you mean? Where is he?" cried Don in astonishment. "He's there, behind those boards." She pointed toward a section of the cavern-like room which Don, for the first time, noticed was partitioned off from the rest of the place. "He's been a prisoner there for years." "A prisoner?" said young contractor in amazement. "Yes," she answered brokenly. "We were both trapped here long ago by Mr. Kelso, who wanted to get possession of an invention of my father's, an automatic coupler for freight cars which he had patented. Mr. Kelso swore my father should never see the light of day again until he assigned his rights to him, and this my father has steadfastly refused to do. I was seldom permitted to see him, but made to work for Mrs. Kelso as a servant, and the threat was held over my head that if I ever breathed a word about my father's presence here, his death would instantly follow. I knew Mr. Kelso was capable of such a crime, and I knew he would not hesitate to carry out his threat, as he bitterly hated my father for his obstinacy in refusing to do as he wished him. He is the direct cause of my blindness, which was occasioned by a fall from the rocks which I sustained at his hands." "The scoundrel!" said Don, clenching his fists. "As long as my father was in his power, I was silent. But now that I see a way for his escape, I fear the Kelsos no longer. I feel you are my friend, that you will protect my father from that man once he is away from this place. Have no fear, Nellie. I will stand by both you and your father. But there's little now to dread from the Kelsos. They have run the length of their rope. I have no doubt but that it was here those rascals were concealed all this time while the police were looking for them. Instead of blowing up the tunnel, they only succeeded in destroying their own place of refuge. I shall send my whole force of men in search of them at once, and I'll wager I'll have them in jail before night." Don had Nellie's father, whose name was ascertained to be Edward Moore, removed from the underground cavern to his mother's home, and Nellie, of course, went there with him. Both received a kindly welcome from Mrs. Winthrop, whose sympathies were naturally attracted to the beautiful little blind girl. Mrs. Kelso was immediately arrested at the cottage on the information furnished by Don Winthrop, and late that afternoon Jim Kelso, his son, and the 2 Italians were cornered in the woods within 15 miles from Lakeview and taken prisoners. They were afterward tried on the charge of attempted murder at the quarry on Jumbo Island, Jim Kelso getting 20 years, the Italians 15 years apiece, and Jerry 7 years. The second indictment, covering the attempted destruction of the railroad tunnel at the High Rock Cliff, still stands against them, and when their terms are out, each will have to face the certainty of another long term. With the exit of the Kelso gang from the scene, there was no further trouble encountered by the Winthrop brothers with the railroad contract, and the work was satisfactorily completed within the contract limit. The 2 young contractors later on obtained the contract for building the trolley road from Lakeview to Greenville. They encountered no opposition from Andrew Newman, because that gentleman had just been tried and sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment for complicity in the tunnel outrage. The boys' profit on the DP&Q branch line was something like $40,000 in all, and they made about half as much on the trolley contract. The summer hotel was duly erected on the selected site alongside the beautiful lake, and proved to be a winner, the 3 years' lease arranged with the Chicago hotel man bringing them in $10,000 per year. The young contractors have greatly extended the business left by their father, and Don is now about to close a deal for building a railroad in Mexico. He will be married in a few weeks to Nellie Moore, the little girl who saved his life in such a wonderful way on Jumbo Island. She is no longer blind. Money was no object to Don where she was concerned, and a great oculist succeeded in repairing the mischief caused by the villainous Jim Kelso so many years ago. Mr. Moore himself recovered his health, shattered by long confinement in the cavern under the Kelso cottage, and he realized a big fortune out of his automatic coupler patent. With everything before them to make life happy, we bid farewell to the young contractors of Lakeview. The end. End of Chapter 16. End of Building a Railroad by a Self-Made Man. End of Fame and Fortune Weekly, number 6. Recording by Keith Salis.